All right, so no one's here at the live. I've waited 15 minutes and nobody's here, so I'm going to just go and go through the lesson and maybe try to schedule a better time next week. I haven't had any luck in these past two times, so anyway, so I'm going through the distributive property. This comes from section 1.7 in your textbook, and this is a property that is used all the time in algebra. It's used so much, and so it's really important to understand this and how to use it, so that if you don't have to worry about it later on when you're learning other new things. So, what is the distributive property? So, the distributive property is a rule that allows us to multiply things together when you have things inside a parenthesis and outside parentheses. Basically, you're taking what is outside and you're multiplying it by everything that is inside. And this allows you to remove the parentheses so you don't have any parentheses at all. So there are two examples here of the distributive property. Usually we see the first one that's listed where you have something in front and then you have your parentheses. So if you have like a number multiplied by something inside parentheses, a times b plus c, what's on the outside gets multiplied by what's on the inside. So you do a times b and a times c. You can also see it where your parentheses are in front and the numbers in the back, but it still is a times b, a times c. I usually use arrows to show when I'm multiplying so I can keep track. And we call it the distributive property because one definition for distribute is, and this is coming from the textbook, is to spread out from one to many. So we're basically taking our single number in the front and we're sharing it with everything in the parentheses. So we're distributing it out, we're sharing it out. So that's where we get the name the distributive property. So I'm just going to go through a whole bunch of examples here to demonstrate. I'm going to show every single step, but you're going to want to get to a point where you can kind of do this in your head. There's really only two steps that you have to write down. When you're doing it in your head, you're just writing down one step instead. But writing that one step can be helpful. And also depending on, actually with some of these may be more than one step because I'm going to show everything so that you can really understand what's going on. But your goal is to do enough of these so that when you multiply, you can do it in your head and then you just write the answer and it's just one step. So I'm going to start with the example on the left. So the directions say to use the distributive property to rewrite each expression. So we have something, a number times parentheses, and then we're going to rewrite it so that we don't have anything in parentheses at all. We're going to take the outside and multiply it by the inside. So I've got 2 on the outside and then parentheses x plus 7. So because this is the first time you're learning this, it's the first time you're really working with variables and everything, a good practice is that if you see a letter and you don't have a number in front, a good practice is to put a number in front. So I'm going to rewrite that x as 1x because if there's no number, you can always put a 1. So I'm going to have 2 times 1x plus 7. So our first step is to use the distributive property. So I'm going to write my directions in a different color so that you can see this. And when you're taking notes, you're going to want to write down the directions as well. So I'm going to take what's outside, the 2, and multiply it by the 1x. Let me move that so you can see that a little better. So I'm going to do 2 times 1x, and normally I just multiply that in my head, but I'm going to literally write that out because I'm writing down every step right now. And then I've got a plus sign inside the parentheses. So whatever the sign is in the parentheses, that's the same sign that you write down. And then I take that 2 and I'm going to multiply it by the 7. So again, I'm just simply writing this down, but I usually do the multiplication in my head. So we have 2 times 1x plus 2 times 7. Now, if we want to get particular about every property that we're using here, in order to do 2 times 1x, we need to rearrange where the parentheses are so that we could do 2 times 1 instead. And when you rearrange parentheses, that's the associative property. So I'm going to write this down. We're going to use the associative property. And that is just simply rearranging the parentheses. So instead of 2 and then in parentheses 1 times x, I'm going to have the parentheses 2 times 1 and then the x. And we use a dot for multiplication because x is a variable. So never, ever, ever use x for multiplication once you're in algebra. I would just get out of the habit, use a dot. And then I still have this 2 times 7 over here. So that's the associative property. I'm just rearranging so that I can multiply my numbers. And then we're actually going to do the multiplication. So I'm going to write that down. We're going to multiply. And so 2 times 1 is 2. So that gives us 2 and then an x. Plus, and then 2 times 7 is 14. And so that is our final answer. 2x plus 14. So you can see that this took us, there's a first step where I rewrote the x. So it was 1x. Then I multiplied or used the distributive property, rearranged by parentheses using the associative property, and then multiplied. Now, you're not going to want to have to show all of those steps because that can get lengthy. Like I said, your goal is to eventually do this in one step. So, you might want to start with writing the step with the distributive property, but maybe you're going to skip the associative property part. And let me put my phone on silent. I forgot to do that. I don't need that to show up. Okay, so you might want to skip the step where you're writing down the associative property and just understand that you can multiply those numbers together when you're multiplying. So let's look at the example on the right. I have -3 times 2z plus 9. So there's a number everywhere. There's no variable without a number, so I don't need to do the first step where I'm rewriting it. So I can go straight to the distributive property. So we will start with that, the distributive property. And so I'm going to take the -3 and multiply it by the 2z. So that's going to be -3 times 2z. And then I write my 2's and the z very different. So I do the curly 2 so it doesn't look like a z. And then I do a z with a line in the middle so it doesn't look like a 2. I try to do my best to make both of them not look similar because that can get confusing. Then I've got the sign in the parentheses is a plus. So I'm going to write down a plus. And then we're going to take our -3 and multiply it by 9. So it gives me -3 times 9. And so I'm not going to write down the associative property here. I'm just going to go straight to the multiplication. So we are going to multiply. And then you just multiply your numbers together. So -3 times 2 is -6. And then I have a z. And then -3 times -9 is a -27. So I have a -6z plus -27. And then what we usually do is when you're adding a negative, we just turn that into subtraction. So we can write this as -6z minus 27. And that would be our final answer. Now, I want you to notice here that when we're multiplying these things, I have one number in front and 2 things in the parentheses. 1 times 2 is 2, so our answer is 2 things. So we have 1 thing times 2 things, 1 times 2 is 2, so you should have 2 things after you're done using the distributive property. If that doesn't match, if you ended up with 3 things or 1 thing, that means you made a mistake. Because if you just count how many things you're multiplying, 1 times 2, you should have 2 remaining. And this rule applies If you have one thing in front and like 3 things in the parentheses, 1 times 3 is 3, you'll have 3 things remaining. It works when we have 2 things times 2 things, which you'll learn about week 4. 2 times 2, you get 4 things out. So the rules of multiplication still apply, even if you're multiplying things with variables and they don't look exactly the same. So all of these have the same rules. We're going to be using the distributive property to just rewrite them because we're just practicing the distributive property. So on the left, I've got 4 times w minus 13z. So I have a w, there's no number in front, so I'm going to rewrite that as a 1w. And if you see subtraction, rewrite it as adding a negative. The reason why I recommend you do that is when you're just learning these things, it's really easy to mess up your signs. So when you rewrite it as adding a negative, you're less likely to make those mistakes. Now, ideally, once you've done enough practice, you don't need to do that step at all, but it's good when you're just learning because it really will save you time in finding your errors and like frustration and all that. So I'm going to start by rewriting this. I have 4 times 1w, and then I'm turning the minus into adding a negative 13z. So once I've rewritten it, I'm going to use the distributive property. So again, I'm going to just write that down. And this is really good for your note-taking, and this is what you should be doing so you can see the pattern that you're doing each time. There's a pattern to math. Doesn't matter what we see in the parentheses. It doesn't matter what number's outside. What's important is the pattern, because once you see the pattern, you know what to do no matter what you see inside the parentheses. So I'm going to be multiplying the 4 times 1w. So that gives me 4 times 1w. And then I have a plus. And then 4 times the negative 13z. So 4 times negative 13z. And this is why it's important to write as adding a negative so that you don't miss that negative sign when you're multiplying. So we're actually going to do the multiplication. So multiply. 4 times 1 is 4, so this gives us 4w. And the variable just hangs on. It's like if you had 4 apples and you're doubling them, you know, have 8 apples. It just hangs on there. It's not relevant to the actual number portion. And then 4 times negative 13z. So 4 times 13 is 52. And I know this because there are 52 cards in a deck, 4 suits, there's 13 each. So that's how I know 4 times 13. I play a lot of card games. So 4 times negative 13 is going to be a negative 52. So I have plus negative 52z. So I've multiplied those out. Now, the w and the z, they're different variables, so we can't add them together. It's like you're trying to add apples and oranges. That doesn't give you a single fruit. That's 2 different fruits. So you can't combine them into a single fruit. So I can't combine these. All I do is just rewrite that plus negative into a subtraction. So we have 4w minus 52z. And when you get really good, you can figure that out from the first step, and you don't have to do your rewriting as plus and negative because you turn it back into subtraction later on. But as I said, it's really important to do the adding and negative so that you don't make mistakes. And you'll see that in my example on the right, because on the right is one of those where I see a lot of people make mistakes with their signs. And so you'll see why I want you to write it as adding a negative. So on the right, we've got negative 2 times 4x minus 1. So I'm going to rewrite the minus 1 as adding a negative. So I've got negative 2 times 4x plus negative 1. So we're going to start by using the distributive property, and you could just write distribute. That's like the verb telling you to do the distributive property. So we're going to have negative 2 times 4x. You may or may not notice I sometimes write say the wrong thing, but I usually write the correct thing. So if what I say doesn't match what I write, look at what I write. That's usually the correct thing. It's just a weird thing my brain does. So we're going to do negative 2 times the 4x, and then we're going to do negative 2 times negative 1. And this is where people mess up. So I've got my plus and then negative 2 times negative 1. So what happens is when you don't write it as a negative, people will forget one of those. If you don't write it as adding a negative, if you leave it as subtraction, people will forget one of the negative signs, and then you'll end up with the answer being the wrong sign. And believe me, I've been teaching algebra, oh goodness, 12 years now. I've seen these errors. I've seen people do this over and over and over again. So believe me, this will save your butt. So next we're going to multiply. So I'm going to do negative 2 times 4, and that gives me a negative 8. And then I have my x, and then plus negative 2 times negative 1 is a positive 2, so I just write plus 2. So because we had that negative 2 in front of the parentheses, it basically changed the signs of what was inside the parenthesis. If you look on the example on the left, the positive in front, we kept the same signs. We had a positive in the parenthesis, and then we had a minus. Our answer has a positive and then a minus. But because we're multiplying by a negative in our second example here, it changes the sign. So in the parentheses, we had a positive and then a minus. In our answer, we have a negative and then a plus. It basically makes them opposite. So it's really easy to miss that if you don't write it as adding a negative. So that's why I write it as adding a negative, because while you're learning all this stuff, it's so easy to make a mistake. Maybe by the end of this class, I would say that's probably when you can switch over to not doing that. But while you're taking the class, I would stick with this, because paying attention to the details, going slow, making sure you don't miss anything like this can save you a lot of time in the long run. Okay, so everybody's favorite thing, fractions. I actually don't think fractions are so bad, but you're going to have to do these things with fractions, and so I want to make sure. Oh, sorry, my computer just made a really weird noise. It scared me. So I know people don't like fractions, so I wanted to make sure I do an example of the fractions, so that way you know what to do. So on the left, negative 1/4 times 2b minus 8. So from here, I've already gone through a few examples where I'm writing down each step. Now I'm going to stop writing down the directions and just do the math. But when you're taking notes, you should still write down those directions, because that's the best way for you to learn. So distributive property, I'm going to be multiplying the negative 1/4 times 2b, and then the negative 1/4 times the negative 8. But first, let's rewrite this. So negative 1/4. And good practice, if you're going to be multiplying by a fraction, turn all of your whole numbers into fractions. So 2 becomes a fraction by 2/1. And then I've got this minus, I'm going to turn into add a negative like we talked about. And then 8, I'm going to write as 8/1. Because when you're multiplying fractions, you multiply straight across the tops and the bottoms. So we need to make sure we have them written in a way that we can do that. So this is how I do it when I multiply fractions. Again, once you get really good with fractions, you don't need to do this step. You can leave them as whole numbers as long as you understand how multiplying fractions goes, but I know that you guys are not there yet because people hate fractions. So I'm going to show all of these extra steps. So the distributive property, we're going to actually do our multiplication. So the negative 1/4 gets multiplied by the 2/1b. Then I have my plus sign, and then the negative 1/4 gets multiplied by the negative 8/1. And it's really important to put parentheses, because if I don't have those parentheses with the negative 8/1, it will look like subtraction. So the parentheses are key to indicating multiplication. So now I'm going to multiply, and you multiply straight across. So I have a negative times a positive, so I know I'm going to have a negative answer. And then 1 times 2 is 2, 4 times 1 is 4. So this gives me negative 2/4 b. And I have my plus sign. Now we have a negative times a negative, which is a positive. And then 1 times 8 is 8. 4 times 1 is 4. So I get 8/4. And now the next step is to reduce these fractions. So 2/4 reduces to 1/2 because I can divide them both by 2. So this gives me negative 1/2 b plus, and then 8/4, you can treat that as division. 8 divided by 4 is 2, so we just get a whole number, 2. And so that is our final answer, negative 1/2 b plus 2. So let's look at the example on the right. I have 2/5 times n minus 5. So I'm going to start by rewriting this so that I have a 1n and then plus the negative 5. And I should put these all over 1 since we are involving fractions there. So it's a 1/1n plus negative 5/1. So when we distribute, I'm going to take the negative 2/5, not the negative 2/5, the positive 2/5, and multiply it by 1/1n. And it's just going to give us 2/5. So like that's something that you can do in your head, but I'm just going to write every step here so that you can see that pattern. And I have my plus sign. And then 2/5 times negative 5/1. So 2/5 negative 5/1. So 2 times 1, when I multiply for my first thing here, I've got 2. 5 times 1 is 5. So that's just 2/5 n. Then we have a plus sign, and then we have a positive times a negative, so I'm going to get a negative answer. 2 times 5 is 10. 5 times 1 is 5. So I get negative 10/5. So now I need to reduce. 2/5 doesn't reduce, so that stays as 2/5 n. And then adding a negative turns into subtraction. And then 10/5 is the same as 10 divided by 5, and that gives us 2, just like we had in the previous one actually. So we get 2/5 n minus 2. So it's not so bad when you have fractions involved. You just have to make sure you make everything a fraction so that you can follow your rules for multiplying fractions, and then you reduce. Okay, so here we're getting a little more complicated. I have a negative and I don't have a number in front. It's just a negative sign. So I have a negative and then a 7q plus 1. Well, if there's no number, you can always put a 1. So we're going to rewrite this as negative 1 times 7q plus 1. So a negative in front of the parentheses is the same as multiplying by a negative 1. And once you put that 1 there, then it's like, oh, okay, I know what to do. So we will distribute. I'm going to do a negative 1 times 7q. So I'm just writing this down, negative 1 times 7q. I have my plus, and then negative 1 times 1. So I'm just writing it down. Then I'm going to multiply, so negative 1 times 7 is negative 7, so I have negative 7q, plus negative 1 times 1 is negative 1. And then we turn that adding a negative into subtraction, so I have negative 7q minus 1. Basically, if you have a negative in front, I mentioned before that it changes your signs. So it took the positive 7q, turned it into a minus 7q, or negative, and it took the plus 1, turned it into a minus 1. So that negative in front just literally changes the signs of what's inside the parentheses. So if you have a negative and you have nothing else, that's all it does. If there's a negative with a number, a different number, like when we saw the negative 4, it does a little bit more, but if it's just a negative in front, that's just changing the signs. That's all it's doing. So on the right here, we've got 3 things in parentheses. So everything we've done, we've had 2 things in parentheses, but the rule applies even if you have more than 2 in a parenthesis. You can have 3 things, 5 things. You can have 10 things. I mean, you can have as many things in the parentheses as you want. The rule applies. It just keeps going. You just keep following the pattern with the arrows. So I have a negative 4 times negative 7a minus b minus 3. So first I'm going to rewrite it so all the subtractions are adding a negative and that the b has a 1 in front. So I'm going to rewrite this as negative 4 times negative 7a plus negative 1b plus negative 3. And again, I'm doing this to help you keep track of your signs. So arrows here, negative 4 times negative 7a. So I'm just writing this down. And writing it down is good to help you double check. Like if you get your answer and you don't have, you make a mistake and you're trying to figure out where did I go wrong. If you've written down what you are multiplying together like I am, it's easier to find your mistake. So the middle here, we have the negative 4 in front. Now I'm multiplying it by negative 1b. Now we have to make sure that we have an arrow going to everything in parentheses. So if there's 3 things in parentheses here, I better multiply by 3 things. So plus that negative 4 times negative 3. So now we're going to multiply all of our numbers. Negative 4 times negative 7. So negative times a negative is a positive. 4 times 7 is 28. So that's 28a plus. Negative 4 times negative 1 gives us a positive 4. So that's 4b plus. Then we have a negative 4 times a negative 3, and that gives us positive 12. And we can't combine anything because we don't have any matching variables. We have things without variables. We don't have to rewrite any adding negatives because everything came out to be positive here. So our answer is 28a plus 4b plus 12. All right. Last 2 examples here, and these are very similar to what we just did. Again, these are 3 things that we're multiplying together. So on the left, I've got negative 6, and then in parentheses 2a minus b plus c. So I'm going to rewrite this. So first, I have my negative 6, I have 2a, and then that minus b, I'm going to turn that to adding a negative and then put a 1 in front of the b. And then I have plus c. I'm going to write that as plus 1c. So you can see what you're multiplying. So negative 6 times 2a. That gives us negative, I'm already wanting to multiply that. And maybe I should for this last one, just actually do the multiplication. Because in my head, I'm so used to just multiplying those numbers together. So negative 6 times 2, negative 12. So we'll just skip those other steps that I was writing. Let's just do it. So that gives us a negative 12a. Now I'm going to take negative 6 times negative 1b. Negative 6 times negative 1 is a positive 6, so that gives us 6b. And then negative 6 times 1c. So that's just negative 6 times 1, which is negative 6, and then c. And then because we're adding a negative, we need to rewrite it. So we get negative 12a plus 6b minus 6c. So now let's look at the example on the right. I'm going to rewrite all these subtractions as adding to negatives. I'm going to put ones where needed. So I'm going to rewrite this as negative 1 instead of a negative in front because we don't have a number. And I'm going to turn this into a negative 1p because we don't have a number there. And then I have subtraction, so then I'm going to make that adding a negative 5q. I have another subtraction, so I'm going to do adding a negative 10r. Now, what some people like to do is to color code. And so I'll kind of give you an example of doing that so you can make sure you're multiplying things together correctly. A negative 1 times negative 1p. So negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. So then you can just write it in that color. So that way you know what you multiplied together if you're kind of matching your arrows. Then if I use a different color, negative 1 times negative 5q. So negative 1 times negative 5 is a positive 5. That gives me 5q. And then let's do orange. The last one, I have a negative 1 times a negative 10r. Negative 1 times negative 10 is positive 10, so that becomes 10r. So you can color code it like that, and that kind of helps you double check what were the two things I multiplied. You can match it up with your arrows. So that's one way that you can kind of keep track of things. You can also see that I've kind of written them underneath, so you can kind of line those up as well. So that's one way you can do this. Some people actually like to color code the whole thing. So let me actually show you an alternate way to do color coding here. So I'm going to just do everything in white and then I'll change the color. So I'm going to just rewrite what I have here. And so let's say I make my number in front yellow, and then I pick another color. Let's kind of match these colors here. So we can do that as a blue. We'll make that a green, and then we'll use our orange there. So I've got like five different colors going on. I was going to count the non-white, but white is also there. So, and then what some people who do this color coding do is that when they rewrite their multiplication part for the distributing, they write that step that I was sort of skipping. You can then see the pattern in the colors. So you can see that that first color, yellow, is in every single one of these terms. And you can kind of start seeing the pattern visually. I know there are a lot of people that are really like color coding, or they like to see things visually. They feel like they're visual learners. So color coding so you can see the pattern could be a helpful way for you to learn what you need to do. So you can see that I've got the yellow is in front of all three of these terms, and then you can see what you're matching up with, the blue, the green, and the orange. And then you can do your multiplication from there. What you do with that color, maybe you're like, well, yellow and blue make green, yellow and green make yellow-green. You know, like, I don't know if you really want to get into the different colors, but from there, I usually just write my final answer in like white if I was to do it this way. So I would get my 1p. I as I was doing this, I found that I missed a negative sign here when I was writing it. So very good that I wrote that. So that's a plus 5Q, and then that gives us plus 10R. So that's an alternative way that you can do to show your work with the colors or whatever if you want, if that works for you. So this is the basics of the distributive property. It really does show up everywhere. So it's important to learn this rule because you're going to be using it a lot throughout the class. So hopefully this video is helpful. Nobody did end up showing up, and I think the noise that scared me was actually the thing logging me out. So yep. So I will be emailing this out tomorrow. Of course, you'll get this that day. So this is past Steph talking to future you. But hopefully this is helpful, and if you follow these practices, this should help you when you're doing the quiz and taking notes. So I will hopefully see you guys next time. Bye.